Good morning and welcome to Tuesday's edition of Ask the SCSA. My name is Joanne Davis and I'm from the Regina office, and I do advisory services here in Regina and in the regions of Swift Current and Moose Jaw. So I'd like other panelists to introduce themselves. Laura, if you can start.
Sure. My name is Laura Lodge. I am also an advisor of the Regina office, and right now my region is the Regina area.
I'm Justin Brooks, another advisor out of Regina, and then I work in the Yorkton Esterhazy regions as well as Regina. So.
Thank you so much. Well, I just want to go through a couple of housekeeping items first. This is live on Facebook, and if you're joining us in the webinar, we do have it where you can post questions in the Q&A feature, and it will be recorded and available later on YouTube as well. So today we are going to be discussing PME, and Laura's going to start off with a presentation.
Okay, thanks so much, Joanne. Yeah, so today's presentation, I'm gonna get it open here, is on powered mobile equipment. Okay, guys, so like I said, we're going over some powered mobile equipment today. We're going to talk about exactly what PME is under the legislation and what it means for employers. We're going to talk about training and competency on powered mobile equipment, which is something we deal with a lot as advisors and through the core process as well. And we're going to talk as well about maintenance of PME and just some other basic legislative requirements when it comes to using this equipment. So we'll jump right in. So the first thing I want to talk about is what exactly is powered mobile equipment under the law. So the occupational health and safety regulations define a vehicle as a machine in, on, or by which a person or thing may be transported, and it includes powered mobile equipment. So if you can transport a person in it, it falls into the category of powered mobile equipment under the law. Now, the second part of that definition is actually the definition of powered mobile equipment. So this is any self-propelled machine that is designed to move or manipulate materials or to provide a work platform for workers. They use the term prime movers in the definition, and basically it's just like a legislative jargon. Anything like that has an engine or a turbine in it would be considered a prime mover. So again, if it's a vehicle, if it's meant to transport people around a job site or a car even, or it's meant to move and manipulate materials, then it falls under what's called powered mobile equipment. So we have some common examples of PME that you might see on a construction site. So the first one here is a backhoe or a loader. So these are very versatile pieces of equipment. They can be used for everything from small demolition projects to light transportation of materials. They can dig, excavate, landscape, break asphalt. They're really, really good. The other one we have there is a grader. In Saskatchewan, we're pretty familiar with these guys. Their purpose is to finish grade, so to refine it, to set it precisely. They're commonly used in construction and on the maintenance of dirt and gravel roads. They create a flat surface where asphalt is generally going to be placed afterwards. Another piece that's really common is an excavator. These come in every size, down to sort of a walk-behind version of them and all the way up to huge excavators that work in mines. So they're primarily used for landscaping and digging large holes and trenches. They lift and place large objects as well, and they're really good for demolishing structures. And then the last one we have there is another really common piece. A lot of you will be familiar with it. It's a skid steer. They are more commonly known by a brand name, a Bobcat. But the skid steer is it's a versatile piece of equipment. It's used primarily for digging, moving dirt and stuff like that. It's very light, it's maneuverable. Its arms can attach to a range of tools. So you can put forks, you can put brushes on them, pretty much anything you could think of. And generally they either have 4 wheels like the one pictured here, or they can be on tracks like the excavator is. Oh, So a few more different pieces of equipment that you might see on a construction site. So this is a dozer or a bulldozer. It's a powerful machine. It's used for pushing earth, rocks. It's used for road building, farming, construction, as well as wrecking. It consists of a heavy broad steel blade or a plate mounted on the front of the tractor. The next one there is a forklift. So quite often we see these usually in finished areas. So where they're driving around on concrete, you don't often see them on uneven dirt and stuff like that, but they're very common. It's used just to lift and move materials over short distances. And then the last one I want to point out here is a lawnmower. So we all know what this one does, but the important aspect here is to note the definitions that we discussed in those previous slides. So what makes a piece of powered mobile equipment? Does it transport a person? In this case, that lawnmower does. It has a seat, it has a seat belt. It's meant to have a person riding on it. It's self-propelled, so you start it up and you hit drive and it goes, and it's designed to manipulate materials. So those three pieces of information mean that this mower would qualify as powered mobile equipment. Some may not, but it's important to keep it in mind, those definitions, so that you know what is going to fall into that category and what might need specialized training in order to use. So some other examples that we have of PME. So scissor lifts. This is a really common one as well. It's a motorized vehicle. It's got a railed platform. It just goes straight up and down. Some of them you can move manually. They do come in quite small sizes. You can see them inside of malls and stuff. They'll usually use for like setting up Christmas decorations and stuff, but they also get quite large. So to reach higher areas and have more than one guy on top of them. Another example there of PME is what's called a cherry picker. So this is just basically a vehicle mounted boom lift or a boom truck. It's a man lift on the top. It's usually attached to a vehicle of some sort, and it's used for raising and lowering workers. So again, that PME, if it's used as a working platform and it has its own self-propelled engine, it's PME. And then we have some other common working platforms that you see on sites. So the first one is the telescopic boom lift. So these are used when crews need to access areas that are blocked by rough terrain or somewhere that the lift can't get itself into. The boom extends quickly and straight out. As you can see, it only goes in one direction. The lift can be driven in some positions with the boom fully extended. But that's very particular to the manufacturer and to the equipment that you're using, what it can and can't do while it's extended or not extended. The other one we have here is an articulating boom lift, very similar to the telescopic, just that it has a few extra elbows, so it can reach into even more difficult areas because it can articulate, allowing the operator to gain access over obstacles or barriers, as well as having the base of it set far back. And then another example there is a spider lift. So this is, again, the same thing, but kind of a smaller version. These are extremely maneuverable man lifts. They're usually used for very tight spaces. And as you can probably see, these outriggers fold up so that you can put it into sort of on a flatbed or something like that to transport it around. Okay, so now that we're pretty clear on what exactly PME is according to the law, let's talk about who is authorized to use them in Saskatchewan. So trained operators of PME. So with this definition, when it comes to who is allowed to operate the PME, the legislation is very clear. So only trained operators are required or permitted to operate powered mobile equipment. So you have to be a trained operator. But what is a trained operator? Well, there's a definition for that as well. So someone who is a trained operator of equipment, they have successfully completed the training program included in elements set out in Table 14.1. We're going to talk about what's in there later. As well as having completed that training, they are completing practical training required by Table 14.1. And while they're doing that, they're doing it under the direct supervision of a competent operator. So again, touching on a competent operator versus a trained operator, A trained operator is somebody who's gone through the training, but they're still working on that practical experience. And a competent operator, it has all that practical experience and they've been deemed competent. So once you've completed both the theory and the practical portion, we'll go into detail about what's required in a little bit later, but you do need to have both. That individual may be deemed a competent operator. So that means that they can operate that equipment without supervision. So we'll jump sort of into the training piece on PME now. So we're going to talk about table 14.1, which we mentioned before. This table is going to tell you everything you need to know about PME, how you need to train your guys, how often you need to train your guys, what's allowed, what's not allowed, even talks about previous training that may be accepted. So table 14.1, there's an image on the left there, discusses what must be included in the training program. So a company, if they're not sure if their training meets that requirement, all they have to do is look at this table, and it's basically a checklist to ensure that you've covered all the information that someone needs to know before they operate PME. So the regulations related to PME, so you need to talk about if there's anything specific to that type, as well as things like duties, the assessment and inspection, as well as actual operation. As well, you need to cover the types of powered mobile equipment. So things like terminology, types, and specific designs to be operated, as well as the actual manufacturer's requirements. So you're not just sort of giving them a general general skid steer course or a general excavator course. You're teaching them on that particular piece of equipment and everything there is to know about that one. As well, you need to talk about site evaluations with the workers. So they need to be trained on proper clearances around PME. They need to be taught how to identify and rectify ground conditions, what's appropriate ground conditions for different types of PME, as well as workers, structures, just keeping clear of all that kind of stuff, as well as the actual controls. So you need to go over your pre and your post check. Operating adjustments and your startup and your shutdown of that equipment. It goes on further to say your classroom training should include the operation of PME, so things like movement, setup, safety, and precautions. And if it's applicable to their workers should be trained on things like rigging, so use, care, inspection, and maintenance of the rigging equipment. And where signalers are required, obviously their position, visibility, hand and radio signals, depending on what you're using on site. So those two may not apply to you, but if they do, you have to train your guys on how to use them, how they work, what the hand signals are, all that sort of jazz. Okay, as well, table 14.1 goes into the maintenance of powered mobile equipment. So the last few things mentioned on the table only applies to the operator if they will be doing maintenance on that equipment. If they're not doing maintenance, then this doesn't apply. But if they are, maintenance of PME, so we're going to talk to them about the schedule of preventative maintenance, so how often the manufacturer actually wants them to do certain maintenance, whether it's oil changes or fluid changes. How often inspections should be done. So generally there's a pre-use inspection, pre and post-use every day. A lot of equipment manufacturers will require certain types of inspections or maintenance be done at different intervals. So at 1 year, at 5 years, at 10 years, or hours, depending on the type of equipment. As well as your maintenance records. So maintaining the records of maintenance, hours of service, authorized persons to do that maintenance. They need to be trained in all of that. Now the bottom section of table 14.1, as you can see here, is a little bit different. Now this one goes into details such as the minimum number of hours that somebody needs to be trained before they can operate it or be deemed a competent operator. So you must have a minimum of 16 hours of training, both theory and practical. Now, the legislation doesn't say you must have 8 and 8 or 4 and whatever, but you have to have a total of 16 hours. It's pretty easy to get, because if you send your guys in for a half day or a 1-day course on PME to get that theory portion, then you're only maybe getting them out on the field for 8 hours, or depending on how many hours your course was. So 16 hours is not a lot of training, considering the types of equipment that they would be deemed competent to operate after that. So, but you must have 16 hours and it must be documented. You must also have basically 1 examination, 1 operator, and 1 specific type of equipment. This comes up a lot because quite often we see people who have maybe been deemed competent on a skid steer, but they weren't actually deemed competent on a Bobcat skid steer or a case skid steer. They were using a Genie or whatever. And the legislation does specify that you have to train them individually on those types of equipment because they vary greatly. And we're going to go into the details on that here shortly. So the other thing that this table goes into is what previous training might be accepted. So if an operator has previous experience in operating a specific type of powered mobile equipment, and that they can demonstrate their ability to the satisfaction of the person that's training them, that person may accept the operator's previous training and experience as meeting all of the requirements of this program. So with that being said, it's pretty common, like in Saskatchewan, we have farmers that, you know, people have grown up using equipment their whole life and have never once gone to a course on it. And that's fine. So to meet the requirement, you still need to have the 16 hours, but this section of the table basically allows you to say, okay, well, if they have the previous experience, and as long as you get them that theory portion of the training, then that experience they have, as long as they can demonstrate that they can use the equipment, that they can operate it smoothly, they can do their startup and their shutdown. They may not necessarily need to do the full 16 hours, but they still have to have a theory portion. So they still have to have that classroom training, but your previous experience may count. Now, that being said, if it's been 3 years or more since you've operated that type of equipment, the legislation requires that the employer reevaluates you, they may retrain you and re-examine you to ensure that you're still competent to use that equipment. 3 years can make a big difference in manufacturers' specifications, what they've changed, what they've added, you know, so if it's been more than 3 years as an employer, you need to make sure that they're still competent and go through that evaluation process. So the next few slides, I'm just going to share some images with you to just really explain the difference between different types of PME and how different they can be. And it's not just easy to hop into one and you know, get going if you've never operated that particular type. So the first round of pictures I have here are some skid steers. So the first one on the left there is a Kubota skid steer. The middle one is a case skid steer, and that one on the far right is a Bobcat. Now they look pretty similar if you don't really know what you're looking for, but they are very different in how they operate. So the Bobcat, for instance, on the far right-hand side there, what we're looking down at is the seat and some foot pedals. And so the Bobcat actually operates its bucket with foot pedals. Now the case and your Kubota skid steers, in the case of the Kubota on the left-hand side of the picture, you'll see a joystick. In the case, you can see there's 2 joysticks on either side of the seat. And those joysticks control both the forward and backward motion of the equipment, but also the bucket. So again, one brand to another, they can vary greatly. So you do need to have some time and some experience in operating them with each piece to make sure that you're comfortable in using those different controls, because it's a lot different from going from 2 hands and 2 feet to control it to just using your 2 hands for those same things, or vice versa. So the second round of pictures here I have are control panels on boom lifts. So this would be either on a telescopic boom lift or articulating boom lift like we had shown in those pictures. But as you can see, there's 3 different panels here. 2 of them are from the same manufacturer, but as you can see, they're very different control systems, right? They're laid out differently. They will do very similar things as far as articulating the arms, moving the boom up and down, but you need to be trained on one piece to another. If you had been using the genie on the left your whole life and then suddenly genie in the middle shows up, you might not be as comfortable operating that. It's going to take you some time to become familiar with those controls and how they work and everything. So we can't stress enough that, you know, just training somebody on one type of lift is good enough, and they'll be good on all. You need to take your time, make sure that workers are trained and that they understand all the controls of this equipment, because you don't want them trying to figure out how to use the controls when you have a load in the air or a person in the air or anything like that. They need to know how to use everything on that equipment, so if something goes wrong, they can control the situation as best as possible. And then the last round of pictures here are from scissor lifts. So again, these are those large platforms with scissor-like underneath. It just goes straight up and down. So on the left there, we have a skyjack. It's got some toggle switches and some gauges and your emergency stop. It's mounted on the outside of the box, and it's the drive function. The one in the middle on the JLG, so these controls, again, they're the same controls as far as driving the machine back and forth and having the emergency stop. But as you can see, there's only one toggle switch and a couple of buttons on here. So it varies greatly from your skyjacks to your JLGs to, on the right-hand side, there is your genie controls. Again, your genie is on the outside, like the skyjack is, but again, it's a very different control. You're going to need to learn how to use it and be comfortable with that unit before you get into it. So just some key points just to cover with comparisons of this PME. Workers need to be deemed competent on each piece of equipment. Your best case scenario is just to document those hours, make sure that there's a supervisor close by watching them while they're doing those hours, and keep them on that person's file, that they're capable of operating your genie lift or your specific JLG or your case skid steer, whatever the case may be. Specific types of equipment to each worker. Document all your training. Equipment specifications can vary greatly even with the same manufacturer. So keep in mind those two genie lifts that we had side by side and the control panels look nothing alike. And that was the exact same manufacturer. So just operating one kind of equipment doesn't make you competent for all types of equipment. And it's on the employer to ensure that the people that they have operating this equipment are deemed competent and that they have sufficient supervision on hand. So we will jump into the maintenance, I guess, of powered mobile equipment. So the legislation is very specific about maintenance, who can do it, what types of maintenance, and when when maintenance needs to be completed on certain types of PME. So when it comes to the maintenance and repair of equipment, the legislation is a little bit vague, but this is actually intentional. So an employer shall ensure that all equipment is maintained at intervals that are sufficient to ensure the safe functioning of the equipment. So again, it's very vague. Okay, we have to maintain it, make sure it's safe. And really the only way to do that is to read your manual. What does your manufacturer say you need to do? They're the experts in it. They designed and built this equipment, so they're going to tell you what needs to be done to make sure that it's in its prime operating condition at all time. So the next slide and my next question is, where would an employer find the information that they need to make sure that the equipment's functioning safely? And that is, in the user manual. Just having my computer's lagging there a bit. So again, this is something that I find in my experience as an advisor, as well as working on job sites. Oftentimes companies and workers, you know, they have a skid steer or whatever, and the last thing they look at is the manual. And we just can't stress enough how important this is. The manual is where you're going to find everything on developing your preventative maintenance program for core. What do the manufacturers say have to be done on this piece of equipment? They are the experts, Again, if you're working towards core, this is a big area that a lot of companies, I wouldn't say struggle with, but it's an area where stuff can get missed easily. So if you need some help in developing the program, that's what the advisors are here for. But the best thing you can do with any piece of equipment, if you're going to be doing any maintenance on it at all, is keeping the manual on hand and following it to a T. Because when we come out to do an audit, that's what we're looking at. Okay, you have a Genie Lift 4000. Where's the manual? What does the manual say you should be doing? And what are you actually doing? So don't throw them away. Read them, know them, follow them. So maintenance goes on. So when it comes to repairing the equipment that is broken down or it has a failed part, the legislation is very clear in this area. So where a defect is found in any piece of equipment, steps must be immediately taken to protect the health and safety of any worker who may be at risk, and that the defect is corrected by a competent person as soon as reasonably practicable. So if there is a defect found, the legislation requires that steps are taken to protect the health and safety of anybody who's at work, or at risk rather, and you must have the defect corrected by a competent person. We talked about that earlier again. They must have the knowledge, training, and experience in order to be able to do that maintenance. So you're not just having anybody do an oil change or flush the hydraulic fluid or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, Laura, one comment on that last one about maintenance. If, let's just say you can't get something maintained right away, is an effective way to lock it out, tag it out, obviously to protect the workers. So when you're advising companies, having an effective log out, tag out system is really important.
No, that's a really good point, actually. Thanks for mentioning that, Joanne. Like she had said, that's part of the core program. So maintaining the equipment is part of it, and having that lockout tagout is actually another piece that's required for core. So just having a system in place to let people know that they can't operate that equipment, that it's currently out of service, is your best bet to do to make sure that nobody inadvertently starts up something that's that could hurt somebody. So workers do have some responsibilities when it comes to maintenance, the most important of which is reporting. So if a worker has reason to believe that, that the equipment under their condition is not safe, they need to immediately report that condition to the employer. Workers can only perform maintenance if they've been authorized by the employer to do so, and that they are competent. So, oh, did I hear something? No. So it's just some things important to note about maintenance. So being deemed competent doesn't necessarily mean that you're competent to operate, does not mean that you're competent to perform maintenance. So those are two separate things, regardless of how minor the maintenance is. I know, again, it comes up a lot. Well, you know, I've been working on equipment my whole life, and that's totally fine. And I'm not here to doubt anybody's experience in their life, because I'm surrounded by nothing but farmers personally. So you just have to document that experience. You just have to say, hey, I've worked on this equipment, or this is the stuff that I've driven in my life. And if you have, you know, letters from previous employers or anything like that, just put it all together, add it all up, make sure that we say, hey, you know, Jeff at this company, you know, he's been operating equipment his whole life, and this is the specific types that we've deemed him competent on, and this is based on his experience working on a farm using this equipment, working at the mine using this equipment. Whatever the case is, it's not impossible. Don't overthink it. If you're having any trouble at all with deciding whether somebody is competent or how to go about becoming competent, just call us and we can help you. We've got forms and everything to do with that. So employers, you must maintain records of competency for your workers and for any in-house maintenance. If we come out to your company to do an audit and one of your guys is doing oil changes on the equipment, great. What makes you competent to do that? Again, just document what he's done, document what his experience is, and we will help you with the rest if you need to figure out how to go about this. And then using third-party maintenance companies may be favorable. So again, it's depending on the type of company, the size of company, what type of equipment you're using. It might make more sense for your company to just have all of their maintenance done out of house. It will save you training costs of your workers. It'll save you materials for doing the maintenance yourself. And it's generally going to ensure that you have the most competent person doing all your maintenance on it, and you can have that documentation. So a lot of companies find that just having that third-party maintenance is better than having to deal with their own. And that's why a lot of companies will even opt for renting equipment instead of owning, because there's a lot that goes with owning equipment. You have to make sure it is good at all times. And that's a lot of work. So if that's an option for you, consider it, because it might save you a lot of time in the long run. So we're just going to touch on some other legislation that applies to PME, some stuff out of the Act and some of the regulations, just some of the more important ones. So employment of young persons. So employer or contractor shall ensure that no person under the age of 16 years old is permitted to work as an operator of PME, of a crane or a hoist of any kind. So if you're less than 16, you shouldn't be anywhere near this stuff. The next one is an employer contractor shall ensure that no worker is ever transported on top of a load. So this one seems probably pretty basic, but you'd be surprised what you see out there. Don't put people on loads, don't put people on buckets. If it's not meant as a work platform, people shouldn't be in it. Where there is an open vehicle or a unit of power mobile equipment, if it's used to transport a worker, they must be restrained from falling. So you got to have seatbelts in there. So the next one I want to talk about is Section 9, and this is dangerous occurrences. And this means any occurrence that does not result in, but could have resulted in either a death or a very serious injury. And this part of that section of the Act actually includes the failures of cranes, hoists, or any overturning of units of powered mobile equipment. So if at any point, for some reason, your JLG, like is pictured here, flips over because we're overloaded, or you didn't have your outriggers out, or whatever the case may be, skid steer, technically your ride-on lawnmowers, your cranes, anything, if it falls over, if it overturns, if it fails, it's considered a dangerous occurrence, and it's a reportable incident to OH&S. So you have to contact them and let it know it happened. And basically when that happens, you're just starting a process where OH&S works with you to ensure that it doesn't happen again, right? Going through your investigation, making sure that you've covered everything. So just a couple more pieces of legislation. So 165.1, workers must be seated and secured when they're inside of a piece of mobile equipment that requires them to be seated and secured. If, say, they're in a JLG or a scissor lift and they're working at heights, they have to wear fall protection. So you have to have an anchor point, a designated anchor point inside of that compartment, and be secured to it. You can't have anything inside PME compartments that isn't secured. So again, you can't have, materials and tools just floating around inside of these things, especially depending on the type of equipment you're driving and where you're driving it. If you're on a big open pit construction site and the ground's really uneven, you don't want to have a bunch of stuff bumping around and falling out or hitting you or knocking into a control. So you want to make sure that everything is secured, and if it's not secure, then it's not in the equipment. The next one there is you must have protection against inclement weather. So if they're working outside and it is pouring rain or anything that could essentially harm the worker, you have to have protection against it. So that's generally pretty good. You're not cutting lawns in the rain or the hail, and most equipment nowadays does have enclosed cabins with air conditioning, so that's lovely. But yes, you do have to be protected against inclement weather. And the last one there is 165.6 specifies that exhaust must not be able to enter an enclosed body of a vehicle. Again, we'd hope that that's the case in every type of vehicle, but again, it's really just making sure that you're doing your pre-checks, that there are no leaks, that there's no hoses running where they shouldn't be, and that wherever you're working, say you're working in an enclosed space, like part of a building that's not quite finished yet, and you're using a gas-powered piece of equipment, well, you might not want to use gas-powered piece of equipment inside of an enclosed space, right? Because now you're going to have exhaust issues. So either funneling the exhaust out and ventilating, or using electric pieces of equipment if it just calls for that, or if it's just a better situation overall. So just making sure that you can't breathe in exhaust as well. So just some key points to cover on the PME. So employers need to keep records of training. Oh, it's popping all over the place. And each worker should have training records, again, for that 16 hours of combined theory and practical for each piece of equipment they're operating. Safety advisors do have samples of this. If you need help, please give us a call. This is what we love to do. Oftentimes we hear a lot of complaints about 16 hours for each piece of equipment. Well, considering that it takes over a year, I think now I think you have to have a learner's and a novice driver's license for 3 years, which means you're driving supervised for 3 years to operate a car. Well, you can potentially be deemed competent to operate a 52,000-pound excavator in 2 working days. So my perspective is that seems relatively fair, probably a little bit more fair. So just make sure that you're documenting it. Again, you don't have to start from scratch with everything. Give us a call and we can help you figure out what you need to do, what you need to document, what's going to qualify and what's not. And the last few things, so again, previous training and experience can count. It may count, but clear, thorough documentation of this is key. Again, help is available with this from advisory services. Employers still need to train workers on the specific types of equipment they will be operating. Your best practice is, doesn't matter what sort of training or experience they have, when they're on your job site for the first day or the first week or the first time they're using your equipment, treat them like a new employee. Go through it from the start, because you never know what people might know, or maybe they're afraid to ask or anything. And your best bet is to just make sure that you've told them everything. And again, employers need to read the manual. The manual is basically your Bible for that equipment. That's what you should be doing to meet the manufacturer's recommendations, the legislation, as well as core. So again, that's what we come in and look at. What's the equipment you're using? What is it the manufacturer say you should be doing? And then we compare that to your actual maintenance records and see if you're meeting those standards. So that basically sums it up for PME. Again, I can't stress enough that advisory services is here to help. If you need help with documenting the training, figuring out what you might need, if it's even worth it for you to go do this, or maybe, like I said, renting equipment versus buying, things like that. I mean, we can't tell you what to do as a business, but we can talk about your options and what may or may not work for you because of what you're required to do by the law, by core if you're going for that, and by your manufacturers. And that's basically it for me, guys.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was a great presentation. So much great information. We covered, there is a lot of legislation when it does come to power mobile equipment, and you covered it very well. Thank you again. I had one question written down, you know, what's the age? And you covered that and had a couple more, so that was really great. At this time too, I want to introduce that Mike has joined us. So Mike, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hey, Joanne. Mike Moore. I'm out of the Saskatoon office. Yeah.
Hey, thank you. I do have a couple pictures I'm going to bring up just to bring up some conversation about PME. We did cover a lot of legislation and a lot of good information, but I'm going to bring up some more site-oriented pictures with power mobile equipment. Give me 2 seconds here to share my screen. Okay, so you should see a piece of power mobile equipment here on site. Okay, so what are some hazards that we can see here by looking at this?
Well, you could tell obviously that you have an issue with vision for the operator. So anyone working in the area obviously would have to take that into account, and that's one of the big points of the high vis vests around equipment is these operators are focusing on a lot of stuff. Maybe the load shifting a little bit. They're on really bumpy ground. They also have on a side boom or a zoom boom like this, if those forks need to lift up a little bit, like let's say that the operator's going over a hump or something like that, and needs to lift that load a little bit higher and stuff, the operator loses the whole right-hand side of the vehicle. So can't see, your blind spots on something like this are ever changing and pretty dramatic.
Mhm.
So I would say that there's a lot of hazards for other workers working around this. Not to mention, even where is this operator driving? They could be running over pins, over stakes. They may not know where any of the hazards are in the area. So I would say using a spotter to bring a large load of wood across the yard is an extremely good idea as well.
Yeah, I agree, Mike. I was going to say the uneven ground, like he's really close to structures. Looks like the earth drops off around those structures too. So he's got a bit of a ledge he's got to stay away from. Yeah, and lots of exposed, well, you can't see it so much on the ground, but there's exposed rebar around. So it would be easy enough to run something over and not see it.
Definitely. And the load, it doesn't look like the top part of that load. There's an extra few pieces of lumber just kind of stuck on top. I don't think that's secure necessarily. I think that it's just placed on there. We're just going to bring that at the same time. So it's important to secure the loads as well. Go ahead, Justin.
It's also kind of hard to tell, but like you were saying with those stacked ones on top, those look like they're actually just resting on the boom head itself, not the actual cage of the loader. So like anybody that's familiar with these or like skid steers or whatever, they'll have on the fork attachments, they'll have their fork, and then there'll be a cage side, which is, they're different for all machines, but they're a certain size. And those ones are just stacked up against the boom itself. So they're really only resting on the center. So of the yellow section there at the end of the boom, that's the only thing. So if that does have any type of shift where it goes over a bump and the load actually shifts a little bit, that top part that's on the dunnage might shift left and actually fall backwards behind the machine. It's kind of hard to explain just in terms of speaking about it, but that balance point is so small without that cage there. It's not resting on two sides, it's only resting in the center, which kind of acts like a pivot point, right? So if they hit a bump, it can actually just fall off this way. And then you end up actually running over top of it, which is it's kind of a recipe for disaster, because if it falls over and then it's resting on top of the pile and you run over it, it forces the end down and then causes it not to flip drastically, but causes that strap load to press into the ground. And it's just a big mess that can end up happening. Then you're breaking ties and sticks are going everywhere. And just because you wanted to get it all in one load, right? When you could have just picked the small one, put it on dunnage, pick the big one, put it away, come back, grab the small one, put it on top. But instead you want to carry it all together.
Yeah, good point,
Exactly.
Chuck. There's a high probability if you're just going to stick material behind the mast, if that's what's going on there, because you're right, it does look kind of funky. If that falls off and you run over it or something shifts the wrong way, that's how you end up ripping hydraulic lines off and doing damage to your equipment, having environmental spills. So what this operator is doing is saving themselves an extra trip, which, let me tell you, is probably not 5 kilometers. But they're saving themselves a trip, but then also putting themselves at risk. Like what's the risk you're taking to accomplish that? Hey, and the risk is that machine actually could be taken out of service.
Well, and one thing, and don't get me wrong, like I've worked on a lot of really compact sites, We used to call it like the boneyard. The boneyard is where you keep all your material. And sometimes you get really lucky and you have just a giant lot and you have all the room in the world for all your rebar and your lumber and everything. And then sometimes you get and I don't know how big this is, but I would assume that this is somewhat congested. So you don't have a whole bunch of room to actually move materials around and stack one thing somewhere, grab that piece, stack it another place. But in order, like Mike, like you said, like the damage, the spills, the property damage, the injuries that could happen, it's best that you figure something out so that you're not doing so, like, you know, as many critical moves, like having everything stacked where you need it right away, and even if it means pulling these apart to move in 2 lifts, whatever you have to do, right?
Now, those are all very good points. That was a great job. Also want to mention here some of the things that are done right. Let's not forget he's carrying the load low and close to, and not pushed out, right? Not extended. So that's going to help with the gravity and the center point of that machine and making sure that to avoid tippage. Because if you don't carry it properly and you do have it, let's say, a little higher, trying to maybe see, or maybe you're trying to avoid some uneven ground, so you want to bring it up a little bit, but you're going to possibly tip that load as well, depending on how secure it is.
So I leave it on this picture because I don't know if we got another one coming up of a Zoom boom, but speaking of inspections, like pre-use inspections and stuff like that, I was on a mine site before, and I was sitting in the head frame, and we were waiting to go underground, and you're kind of just sitting around chatting. You get there about a half an hour before the cage ever comes up because the cage is moving whether you're there or not. And the Zoom boom was used to load material on into the cage. Actually, underneath the cage, the man cage or person cage, there was hooks, and then what you would do is you would take a piece of machinery, for example, apart on surface and bring it down piece by piece, or if you needed piping or you needed something heavy, and you'd hang it underneath the cage in the head frame and lower it down to underground and then unload from there. And they use this Zoom boom in the head frame all the time. So I'm standing there and I'm just looking at the head frame, right? I'm just doing an informal, I decided actually to do an informal inspection, so I didn't use a forum. I'm just going to do a walk around on this vehicle, take a peek at it, because I noticed the forks were a little bit uneven. Like maybe one fork was a couple inches higher than the other. And I started looking at it. I got up close to it, and actually what had happened is that it had been overloaded, or you know, some sort of stress was applied to the mast on that thing in the fork system. That one fork had actually, there's a pocket, a pipe and a pocket, and the weld had started opening up on the pocket, and potentially on one of the lifts coming up for that, they could have dropped a fork. Like a fork would have actually come right off the machine and potentially dropped a load and a fork down the shaft in this mine site. If something like that would have happened, that could be a major incident where you would have a major shutdown of the site. You'd have workers refuging underground. You would have millions of dollars as a result of a piece of equipment that had damage on it that wasn't picked up in an inspection. So real important on this stuff to do that pre-use inspection. And then also during the day, take a look at your machinery, because stuff can happen when you're not using it, when you weren't around, or you missed it on a visual, someone missed it. Really, that inspection piece is a real important piece. You would hate to see a piece of equipment fail in the middle of using it.
Well, that's a great point, Mike. Inspection of the vehicle as well as inspection of the environment and your trip. You know, take a look at where you're going, what is your route, inspect that as well. It's going to be really important. Here's the next picture here. This is just working off a scissor lift. It looks like they're doing some welding potentially up there. So some of the things here, obviously we do have the groundwork. Some of it is has been excavated or broken up. They do have a piece of metal behind them as well, so if they were going to back up. This is an electric, well, I can't tell if this one's electric or the tool they're using is electric.
Well, it'd be a
I
bad
think
reach.
I think it's an electric skid
Mhm.
steer or skid steer. Sorry, scissor lift.
Mhm.
Yeah, it looks electric, but yeah, right away it's like, I mean, hopefully they don't have to drive over those rocks, but yeah, uneven ground that looks like maybe a piece of steel stud behind them, and then even further back, even more stuff. Obviously they're doing something very hot. Not sure if they have a fire extinguisher close by.
As well as overhead hazards is really important on this one. When you're working on power mobile equipment that's bringing you up, or you have to be aware of your surroundings and taking a look at overhead hazards and crush points and stuff like that as well.
The other thing is he's not wearing a harness. Neither one of them are, I don't believe. Yeah, and another point here, and I've seen it quite often, is that you have to wear fall protection inside of the lifts. Your lifts have to have a designated anchor point. I've seen companies that ordered lifts from the States and couldn't use them here because they don't have anchor points. And then I totally lost my train of thought for the third point there. But yeah, fall protection, they have to wear them. And they, oh, sorry, what I was going to say was that I've seen a lot of guys work on scissor lifts like this near a column and tie off to the column. And again, that's not allowed. You have to tie off to the lift that you're on. You can't tie off to adjacent structures. So, but they're not wearing anything. So.
Can I'll add on to that too. Joanne, can you unshare your screen so you can see this? I have a diagram here of a display. It's a die grinder with a man basket on it, okay? So we got a little person basket, and our little person is an air fitting. People say, you know what, I don't want to stay in a basket. If it goes over, if it falls over, I'm jumping. I'm getting out of this thing. Hey, I am scramming. I'm not going down. I don't want to, like, you're going to be hurt. If you go down in a scissor lift, you're going to be hurt, like, no matter how. But let's look at the option of not wearing a fall protection. Like, the whole point of a fall protection device inside of the scissor lift is kind of like a seat belt. It keeps you in the scissor lift. It keeps you that, because what'll happen is that scissor lift's going to go down. And it's like, oh my goodness, I'm tipping. It starts going out. The worker jumps out. Oh no, can you even see that? Yeah, you can. The worker jumps out. They fall right here, and that scissor lift, the basket falls right on that worker and crushes them. It's the same thing with seat belts with rollover protection on forklifts and stuff like that. That seat belt's designed to keep you in it. Yes, if it goes over, you could be hurt, something like that. For one, though, if I'm driving a forklift and I hit something, if you know, it's like shoveling and you hit the crack in the sidewalk and it just stops you suddenly. You're gonna face plant into the steering wheel or into the mast of the machine, that kind of stuff. Seatbelt is mandatory because it keeps you in that. And if it does go over, if a forklift goes over and you're in that forklift and you want to jump and you don't have a seatbelt on and you're able to jump, the same thing happens. The mast of that forklift falls, you jump out, fall on the ground, and the mast falls right on you. So seatbelts and harnesses are extremely important.
Yeah, absolutely. It's yeah, unfortunately, I think a lot of people seem to think that they're suddenly going to become parkour experts in the middle of a piece of equipment falling over, you know,
Right.
And be able to jump out of the way. And it's just, don't rely on your ability to react in the second as your like control mechanism, right? You want to control it before all that and make sure that you're not going to have to think about what you need to do and where you need to land and stay out of the way. It's just not going to work. You're not going to be able to do it. It's going to be over in 2 seconds.
On the topic of seatbelts, this is something I really wanted to get across. This was someone that was part of my family, was involved in a skid steer incident. This was on their farm. They were doing work on their farm. And they were driving up a very slight ditch and something gave way. I wasn't sure. I'm not too exactly 100% on why they rolled, but the skid steer rolled backwards. Going up a hill, you know, when the dirt broke out underneath, it rolled backwards. It went past the counterweight, rolled backwards. The person that was operating the Bobcat never wore their seatbelt. Just, you know, you throw down the safety arm that turns all the lights on and makes the machine go. Wasn't wearing their seatbelt. And when the machine flipped, their head actually slammed into the roof of the skid steer and broke 2 vertebrae in his neck. He was never he was a mechanic by trade, was never able to work on an automobile again because he lost the use of his hands. It was basically had minimal control over a lot of things. And he had some other health conditions, but was not able to actually, could grip an apple if really concentrated on it. Really could make a fist, but it's not the same, right? So I always just tell my guys, like, I don't care how fast you're going. If you're just sitting in there to sit in front of the fan and cool off, the moment you sit down in that seat, the seatbelt goes on. I don't care what you're driving or what you're doing, the seatbelt goes on because it can happen so darn fast.
My neighbor at the lake, Justin, on the weekend, he's told me the exact same thing about a different person. Skid steer incident, rolled the skid steer, took him out. Hey, broke his back. I think the guy is, he owned a business. The funny thing is he owned a business. He owns a business. They build RTMs and sell all kinds of stuff, and it wasn't doing safety properly. And now is, I don't know what the results is, but broke his back pretty bad, I heard.
Yeah, definitely unfortunate events. It's why it's so important that proper training is in place and that we don't become complacent. Take a look at that manual. The best place for that manual is with the machine in case you have to reference it. You want to know what kind of grade can I work on? What's that slope? What's my maximum slope? Take a look at your environment and make sure proper training is in place, documented, and that you're able to work safely and avoid these incidences. So that's pretty well all the time that we have for today. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you to the panelists. I do want to let you know that on Thursday, we do have a guest speaker coming from Canadian Blood Services, and they're going to go over some of the need for blood, the process on how to donate and what happens there, as well as how you can help out as an individual or even as a group. So we're going to take a look at that. That's so important when we have people in need in the community, whether it be ourselves, somebody we know. It's so important. So thank you again, and we hope to see you on Thursday.